China, the Long March. Prologue and Chapter 1. The Long March of the Chinese Red Army is one of the most amazing chapters in world history. It was a headlong retreat of nearly 6,000 miles across snow-covered mountains, marshlands, and turbulent rivers in the wildest regions of China. 80,000 soldiers of the main force began the march in 1934, pursued by the armies of the nationalist government, the Kuomintang. The enemy was bigger, better equipped, and supported by a large air force. Only a few thousand ragged survivors reached journey's end in a remote corner of Shanghai province. Yet they and their leaders, Mao Zedong, Zhou Enlai, and the rest, went on to recruit new strength and in 1949 marched into Beijing to set up the new People's Republic of China. China was a cruel home for most of its toiling 400 million people. Despite its size, the third largest country in the world after the Soviet Union and Canada, much of it was mountain and desert. In time of drought or flood, millions perished. An outdated Manchu dynasty and an evil Empress Dowager had held China back from the 20th century. They were overthrown in 1911, and a would-be democratic regime was tried and failed. Then the 1917 Russian Revolution echoed around the world, and the Chinese Communist Party was founded in 1921. Its fortunes waxed and waned. By the early 1930s, its armed forces were in control of scattered areas containing some 5 million people. The anti-communist Kuomintang leader, Chiang Kai-shek, determined to wipe them out. For him, this was more important than resisting the invading Japanese. The communists, outnumbered and outgunned, began moving westward to escape the Kuomintang offensive. That was how the Long March began. Although nobody called it the Long March then. The communists were merely scorned as red bandits on the run. Yet from the survivors came the leaders of modern China. The party elite in Beijing today are men who were on the Long March. It has deeply influenced their thinking. For 50 years, their sufferings and the lessons they learned on that long retreat have moulded China's attitudes and policies. Mao Zedong summarized those experiences later. For 12 months, we were under daily reconnaissance and bombing, encircled and pursued, obstructed and intercepted by a huge force of several 100,000 men. We met untold difficulties and dangers on the way. We swept through the length and breadth of 11 provinces. The Long March has proclaimed to the world that the Red Army is an army of heroes. Chapter 1. How it all began. The Long March is now an official legend, with its own museums, relics, and literature. The truth may be stranger. But so many sources are lost, so many voices silenced. Very few of those who survived the march are still alive today, 50 years after. The hardships and heroisms, desertions and power struggles are all blurred by time and politics. It is often impossible, recalling river crossings, battles, forced marches over mountains, to know exactly what did happen at particular stages of the march. But the basic story casts a shadow touching everyone in China. Certainly, when it began, the communists in China were losing their hold on the 5 or 6 areas they still controlled by force of arms. They ran those areas, they called them Soviets, on communist lines, killing off landlords, distributing land among the peasants, indoctrinating, recruiting poor peasants, tenant farmers who had suffered rent demands, taking half the harvest and tax demands presented years in advance, were often ready to support a collective regime. They were joined by the dispossessed of all kinds, deserters from warlord armies, lawbreakers, the homeless, those living in areas the communists took over, had anyway no choice. But guns, bombs, and big battalions were the prevailing argument, and there the communists were lacking. One important Soviet was just north of the Yangtze River, where a famous general, Xu Xiangqian, had built up the communist Fourth Front Army with Jiang Guotao having the decisive voice as political leader. Under heavy attack by better armed Kuomintang forces, they retreated westward in 1932. After losing enormous numbers of men to enemy air bombing, they managed to set up another Soviet far to the west in Sichuan province. Also under growing pressure was a smaller communist area around the town of Sangzhou, near the borders of Hunan and Hubei provinces. It was commanded by the legendary He Long, a general in his 30s, hero of 100 fights and the terror of warlords, of landlords and officials. Another Soviet survived intermittently up in Shanghai province, just west of the Yellow River. The principal communist base, however, was the Jiangshi Soviet in southern China, where Mao Zedong, farmer's son, teacher, poet, and dedicated revolutionary, argued and fought for the leadership of the millions of China's peasants. His close colleague was Zhu De, commander-in-chief of the communist forces. Also active in Jiangshi were many more who would later play leading parts in communist China: Zhou Enlai, Deng Xiaoping, Chen Yi, Lin Biao, Peng Dehui, Nie Rongzhen. In the early 30s, they were scarcely known. The man of the hour was Chiang Kai-shek, national leader, soldier, statesman, and sworn enemy of the communists. His advisors were high-ranking German generals. His resources, enormous. When Chiang's forces surrounded the Jiangshi Soviet, the communists had to choose between extermination if they stayed, or breaking out and trying to link up with another communist area. They broke out. How did Mao and his colleagues find themselves in this desperate situation? Why was the communist movement losing out, despite the wretched state of millions of Chinese peasants? 13 years had passed since the first meeting of the Chinese Communist Party, convened secretly in Shanghai in 1921. From the outset, the communists had been unable to agree on policy. Some, like Mao Zedong and Zhou Enlai, argued for armed struggle. Others insisted on a quieter approach. From early on, the voice of the Moscow-backed Communist International, Comintern, was decisive in planning and policy. The Chinese party lacked funds, membership, and above all, experience. It listened to seasoned revolutionaries from the West, men who could equate Marxist-Leninist wisdom with the poverty-stricken feudalism of the Chinese countryside. The Comintern sent confident Moscow-trained advisors ready with instructions, rarely relevant to China's problems. They echoed the voice of Stalin and sought to ensure that no developments in China would conflict with Soviet interests. Meanwhile, the Chinese people despaired. True, the deplorable Manchu dynasty had ended in 1911, but what had its successor, the Republic of Sun Yat-sen, brought to China? Not stability and progress, but only civil war, with soldiers looting the farms, 1,000 warlords running their petty kingdoms, and huge foreign debts. Sun Yat-sen died of cancer in 1925. The communists had cooperated with him, and they were working inside the Kuomintang when Chiang Kai-shek took over the leadership in the following year. He seemed to offer hope to the Chinese people with his famous march north to the Yangtze River, defeating powerful warlords on the way and taking over Shanghai. Surely the communists, in working with him, would share his glory and win the support needed for supreme power. It was not to be. Instead, Jiang, turning against the communists, ordered them to be massacred by the thousands. in Shanghai and other cities. Legend has it that Zhou Enlai missed death by seconds. The survivors made for the countryside, or hid where they could. Yet incredibly, they were instructed by Moscow to launch attacks on cities, to start an urban revolution. The communists did as they were told, fighting their way into towns with the backing of peasants or rebelling army units, only to be driven out again and hunted across the rice fields and mountains. Days of contempt. Remnants of communist units found safety in remote rural enclaves where they set up primitive bases, their Soviets. The safest retreats were in mountain ranges straddling provincial borders. Warlords on either side rarely cooperated against rebels and bandits. Mao Zedong and his battered companies, about 900 men in all, found refuge on the forbidding massif of the Jianggang Mountains, on the borders of Jiangshi province in southeast China. This was a wild country of mists and forests, haunted by tiger, wild boar, and bandits. Mao teamed up with the bandits, glad of the extra firepower. Then another motley horde of several thousand arrived, guerrillas with spears and knives, women and children, and a hard corps of some 600 men with rifles, all led by Zhu De. For Zhu, hardships were nothing. In the village where he grew up, children were often drowned at birth because there was simply not enough food to go round. He had escaped from this rural hell when a rich uncle paid for him to be educated. Zhu had travelled and studied in Germany, fought as a government army officer, taken to opium but cured himself, and later turned to communism as the one remaining hope for China's peasants. Mao and Zhu were powerful partners. Mao was the thinker who could take Marxist ideas and try to adapt them to China's situation. Zhu translated Mao's thinking into victories in the field. He appreciated and upheld rules of discipline worked out by Mao, which respected peasants as human beings. These rules were simple and direct. Obey orders. Take nothing from peasants or workers. Hand in everything confiscated from landlords. Replace doors you borrow for use as beds. Replace straw borrowed for bedding. Speak politely. Pay fairly for what you buy or for anything you damage. Don't bathe in the sight of women. Don't search prisoners before turning them in. Set out in 16 characters enshrined in all future guerrilla textbooks were Mao's victory tactics for victory against a much bigger and better equipped enemy. Quote, "If the enemy advances, we retreat. If he halts and encamps, we harass. If he avoids battle, we attack. If he retreats, we pursue." Zhu and Mao worked together, and the Jiangshi communists moved down from the mountains and spread their area of control in the lowlands. Villagers believed there was just one leader, Zhu Mao. By the beginning of the 1930s, after the years of defeat in urban uprisings, Soviet areas were slowly growing in several provinces of China. The underground party leadership, surviving dangerously in Shanghai, came to realize that perhaps the one hope of achieving a communist China lay in remote country areas, working among the peasants. It was pointless for Moscow-trained committee members to quote Lenin on the urban proletariat being the spearhead of revolution. The situation in the towns was untenable. Urban workers might strike for a living wage, but they would not be looking for the defeated communists to organize or support them, not after the Shanghai massacres. If revolution were to come, it would be from the countryside, though the towns might join in later.